It's an honor for me to be the lead pastor of Holy Trinity Lutheran Church, to be your pastor, to be with you together in the mission that we've declared is to share God's love that we've first received from God with a world that's so hungry to be loved. Whether it's the poor and the hungry who don't have enough, or whether it's the busy folks who run to their jobs and do all of the things that come with parenting and living life and sometimes struggle to find peace, sharing God's love is what we're about. Our stewardship campaign this year has been an exercise in thinking about God's grace, and so for the next few moments I'd like to ask you to listen to the Bible study that follows. Have it help your heart and your soul become connected to the God who gives everything, who loves everyone and everything, and who supplies us all we need. Thanks. Abundant Gifts for Abundant Love, God's Call and Provision for the Mission of the Congregation. This presentation is a short video version of what was presented to members who gathered in the congregation on two separate occasions as part of our stewardship program this year, which is called First We Give of Ourselves. We're glad you're taking a moment to go through this so that as many of us as possible can share in the experience of some Bible study that teaches us about giving and some information that helps us think about the year ahead. When we talk about money in the church, people can get, upset. It's been said that it's kind of like teaching a pig to sing. It annoys the pig and frustrates the teacher. The folks who sit in the pews, so to speak, hear the appeal for money and feel, guilty or resentful or a little put upon, hoping people will just mind their own business when it comes to their money. The people who are doing the asking aren't in any better shape. They stand and feel guilty and know that everybody else is upset about it. So it's not a pleasant thing in often circumstances. That's interesting to me because really when we give in the church, it's not like paying our bills. It's not like giving money to a nonprofit organization that's a worthy cause. When we give in church, we're giving to God first. And so our giving is an act of grace that's directed toward the grace we've already received. So we want to spend some time looking at some Bible passages in this particular presentation that help us understand what giving in the church is all about. In the 19th chapter of Luke, we're introduced to a story about a man who is a true outcast. The man is known as Zacchaeus, and you may have learned about him when you were a Sunday school kid. There are all kinds of little songs about him. He was a chief tax collector, and he had lots of money, but he didn't have lots of friends. To compound things, he was a short little guy, and so he had to crawl up in a tree in order to see Jesus. Jericho was a symbolic place for the people of Israel. It was the place where when Israel first entered the Promised Land, they defeated the people who lived in Jericho by playing trumpets and having the walls fall. It was a place where promise and salvation started to happen. So we want to look for that as we look into this passage. Luke tells us the story this way. It says, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man there was named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and he was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd he could not because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him because he was going to pass that way. Zacchaeus was an outcast in the crowd for a number of reasons. He was an outcast in the crowd because he was a chief tax collector. Now, chief tax collectors in those days collected taxes by sending out other tax collectors to sit at the highways and byways and collect duties as people passed by with goods to trade or whatever the case might have been. Zacchaeus was in charge of all of them, and all of the tax collectors received their money by charging more than Rome demanded. So if Rome wanted 10%, the tax collector would demand 20% and keep 10% for himself. That's how he made a living. Now, if you're a chief tax collector, what you did was, if Rome wanted 10%, then you took 10 or 20% more on top of that, and then you ordered your tax collectors who work for you to take 10 or 20% more on top of that so they could live. It really was kind of a government-oriented extortion theme. You might be thinking of the IRS right now, but it was a very different thing. Zacchaeus was an outcast in that crowd because he was a chief tax collector, and among the Jewish people, that meant he was a collusion agent with Rome. He cooperated with the oppressing powers. On top of all that, he's short, and I guess that probably didn't help him out very much. So when Jesus came to Jericho and his fame kind of came before him, Zacchaeus wanted to see what all the hubbub was about, and not being able to see over the crowd, he crawled up into this tree to see Jesus, because Jesus was going to pass by on that way. It makes me think that keeping our eyes on Jesus can be tough. There's a lot of distractions in the world. There's a lot of people who stand in front of us. There are a lot of heavy duties that we have in our lives that keep us from always seeing where Jesus is at. The text goes on, when Jesus came to the place, he said to him, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." This is a huge invitation from the Son of Man. And we might wonder to ourselves, how does he even know Zacchaeus is up in the tree? How does he know he's there? Well, it could be because he's the divine Son of God. It could be because Zacchaeus also has a reputation that's preceded him. Whatever the reason, Zacchaeus doesn't escape notice in that tree, and Jesus decides to have dinner with him. To say, "stay at your house today," means we're having lunch together. Now, that's a problem in the first century of Palestine, because when you ate with somebody, that implied that you liked them, that you not just liked them, but that you agreed with them, that you shared the same view of the world, and that your religion was on the same par. You didn't eat with unclean people. You didn't eat with people who weren't faithful. So, when the text says that Zacchaeus hurried down and was happy to welcome him, it's no surprise that all who saw it began to grumble and said, "He's gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner." They all saw Zacchaeus as a sinner who cheated the people. They all saw him as somebody who made more than he should. They all saw him as somebody who cooperated with Rome. The interesting thing here is that Zacchaeus is recognized by Jesus, even though everybody thinks he's a sinner. He's recognized by Jesus even though he's short. He's recognized by Jesus even though he's up in the branches of a tree where nobody would think to look, probably hidden by the leaves. This gracious acceptance is something that transforms Zacchaeus. Something happens to Zacchaeus because Jesus told him to come down. Zacchaeus stood up and said, with everybody listening as they were whispering to themselves about Jesus eating with sinners, "Lord, look, half my possessions I will give to the poor, and if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much." Now this is interesting because a tithe in ancient Israel is 10% of your possessions. He offers to give half. Maybe that's just because he's accumulated so much and won't miss it, but maybe it's something different. He also says if he's defrauded anyone, he'll pay back 4 times as much. Well, that's twice as much as the law of first century Palestine demanded. The Jewish law said you should double what you've cheated people out of. Now Jesus says to him, "Today salvation has come to this house because he too is a son of Abraham." Notice it's not because he gave the money back. It's not because he made amends with the people he cheated. It's because he's a son of Abraham. And then Jesus gives us his motives. "For the Son of Man came to seek out and save the lost." Zacchaeus was lost, apparently, and now he's found. The power of grace has taken Zacchaeus from being a man hiding in a tree and hiding from his neighbors, perhaps, a man who was despised by everyone, to somebody who doesn't worry about that, but instead has been touched by God's grace and gives freely because of it. That's why we give. We give because God has first accepted us in Jesus Christ. We give because everything that we have has come from God, even the breath around us and the hearts that beat in our chests. The The power of grace is something that changes us from being folks that are looking out for ourselves to folks that look out for others and folks that act in grace. The source of giving is receiving the grace of God. Now I want to look at a story that talks about the source of abundance. We live in a culture today that pretty much thinks everything is about scarcity. There isn't enough of anything. There isn't enough money, there isn't enough food, there isn't enough, time. There isn't enough of anything in our lives. And so we manage it like it's going to run out very soon. But the Bible teaches something very different about that. It says that if we are trusting God, then God will give us, as the Lord's Prayer says, our daily bread, everything that we need. Maybe not everything that we want, but everything that we need. In the book of 2 Chronicles, which is a chronicle of the kings of Judah and Israel, we encounter kings who are good kings and kings who are bad kings. Hezekiah, who's about 25 years old when he comes to the throne, has had a father and a grandfather and a couple of other relatives before that on the throne who weren't very good kings. They led the people astray. They allowed them to set up idol worship in the land. They allowed them to worship other gods. They forgot that they needed to continue to worship God and to follow the Ten Commandments, to do the things that the priests and Levites asked them to do, to make sacrifices to God. And they'd stopped doing all of that. So Hezekiah comes to the throne. He begins to initiate reforms. One of the reforms that he institutes is to command the people who lived in Jerusalem to give the portion that was due the priests and Levites. This is because the priests and Levites, they kind of ran the church that day, in those days. They were the people who offered the sacrifices and provided the spiritual counsel to the people of Israel. They made sure that the temple ran correctly. And because the people had stopped bringing their offerings according to the law, the priests and Levites had to go get other jobs, and so were busy doing those things instead of doing the sacred things of the temple. So Hezekiah wants to change that, and he tells the people of Jerusalem to give the portion that was due to them, the tithe, the first fruits of the ground, 10%. That would allow them to devote themselves to the law of the Lord. Now, the word spreads, and people are excited about Hezekiah as their king, so the people of Israel, it says, gave in abundance the first fruits of the grain, wine, oil, and honey, and all of the produce of the field, and they brought in abundantly the tithe of everything. Tithing is an ancient idea from Scripture and from other cultures in that time. Tithing is taking the first that you get and the 10% that you get and giving it to God so that the rest of what you have is what you live on, 90%, and that the first thing you think about in all those things is God. The king sparks reform in a time when all through the kingdom there was an idea that things were scarce. They worshipped other idols because they thought that they would get better harvests with better gods. They thought that there wasn't enough of anything. Well, Hezekiah tells them to bring the tithe nonetheless, and strange things start to happen. The people of Israel and Judah who lived in the cities, it says, also brought in the tithe of cattle and sheep, and the tithe of the dedicated things that had been consecrated to the Lord. They laid them in heaps. Heaps. I've never described the offering in church as heaps, but here it is. The offering is laid in heaps. In the 3rd month they began to pile up the heaps and finished them in the 7th month. Now when Hezekiah and the officials came and saw the heaps, they blessed the Lord and the people of Israel. Why did they bless them? Well, because the heaps are pretty big. Did God provide? Yes, God provided more than enough for the Levites and the priests and for the taking care of the widows and orphans and resident aliens among them. God provided when they listened to God's command. Hezekiah, it says, questioned the priests and the Levites about the heaps. Where did this all come from? How much is this? And the chief priest Azariah, who was of the house of Zadok, answered him, since they began to bring the contributions into the house of the Lord, we've had enough. Notice that. We've had enough. and have plenty to spare. For the Lord has blessed his people so that we have this great supply left over. Leftovers. Leftovers from the offerings. So Hezekiah has to command them to prepare store chambers in the house of the Lord. So what happened to the idea of scarcity when the people responded to God? It was kind of blown up. When people listened to God, there was more than enough to share with everyone. There was more than enough that they had to build store chambers in the house of the Lord, and so they prepared them. God is able to provide us with everything that we need in abundance. That's something that's hard to trust, but something that's core to our faith. Now, the other thing about grace is that it provides us the source of mission. In the book of Acts, we hear in the 4th chapter the ongoing story about the people of Jerusalem who'd come together to follow Jesus Christ. Following the disciples and the day of Pentecost, more and more people are being added to the church every single day. We're told in the 4th chapter that things have gotten pretty organized. It says, "Now the whole group of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common. They were living communally. With great power the apostles gave their testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all." Now, before you get nervous, nowhere are we going to suggest that we claim no private ownership and that we share everything in common, that our houses are owned by the church or something weird like that. What we want to make sure that we look at, though, is how the church in Acts was transformed by the grace of God and how that grace manifested itself in ways that we can understand. The question I want to ask is, how does our congregation hold things in common? Like I said, we don't own our houses together. We don't have a common bank account. But there are certainly things that we do that make sure that we hold things in common. We're all part of a family here at Holy Trinity Lutheran Church. We're part of one family, and so we hold the mission of the church in common. We hold the building in common. The responsibilities for taking care of that building we hold in common. We establish a budget every year by the vote of the congregation, and so we hold the mission that we decide to spend on in common. We have common work to do. We're all in this together. If one of us doesn't support the church in the way that we can, then we force somebody else to support the church and do our share as well. We're all together in the mission of God, and so we hold things in common by having budgets, by giving together, by taking common responsibility for the life of the church. Acts goes on and says, "There was not a needy person among them." Can you imagine that? Not a needy person among them. "For as many as owned lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold. They laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each as any had need." For example, it says, there was a Levite, a native of Cyprus, Joseph, to whom the apostles gave the name Barnabas, which means son of encouragement. Well, how did he encourage people? Well, one way is he sold a field that belonged to him and then brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet so that it would make sure there weren't any needy persons among them. Anybody who had a need got what they needed from the church because they held everything in common. What was the result of the generous response to God? Well, the response was that there wasn't any needy people among them, that there wasn't any need that didn't go unnoticed, that they had plenty of money to do the mission of the church, which was to love as Christ had loved them. So when it comes to giving to the congregation, we don't give because it's a worthy cause. We don't give because of guilt. We don't give because we're supposed to. Our giving is something different. Giving to God is an act of love and trust in God. We've been loved by God, so we give back to God, so that all of us might share together the good work that God does. It's an act of trust that God will continue to provide for us. It's a discipline that grows generous hearts. Jesus said, "Where your treasure is, there will your heart be." So if you want your heart to be in God, well, your treasure's going to have to go there too. That seems to be what Jesus is clearly saying. And so giving trains our hearts to be centered in God.